How's it going, everyone? We are live. We've got breaking news, crazy news. In the past hour, the United States Trump administration has basically set out what is going to be an MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, that the US and the Iranians are agreed on. And it feels like it's the genuine thing for quite a few different reasons. But it is also a huge, massive, strategic humiliation for the Trump administration. I don't think there's any other way to put this. It is about as worse a deal as you can get. And well, we're going to break that down with Trita Parsi, who we had on yesterday, but he's back again because, well, Trita is fantastic for being able to jump on last minute. Trita, I mean, what do we make of this right now?
Well, first of all, I mean, look, I agree fully that the war was a huge mistake. I was dead set against it. However, striking a deal, I don't think is a strategic defeat. I think it is something that avoids a much, much worse situation. And we don't know the full details of this yet, but what has been recurring is that there will be a significant intensification of some of the nuclear variables compared to the JCPOA. The Iranians will likely not be enriching at all for a couple of years, perhaps up to 12 years. That is not what the JCPOA had. They will not keep a stockpile on their own soil, most likely. In the JCPOA, they had up to 300 kilos. There will likely be either a full or 98% or some significant number of the 60% stockpile that will be shipped out of the country. Now, of course, the 60% did not even exist prior to Trump walking out of the JCPOA, so it was a non-issue. But they did ship out all of their 20% in the JCPOA. So there's a lot of these different things that I think one can point to and say, well, this is actually stronger than the JCPOA. On the other hand, you have a different situation now with the Iranians being in control of the Straits, but this matter appears to be shifting towards some sort of a either Iran-Omani management or regional management. So does this mean that the war was successful or failed? I mean, I think the war was a disaster in many different ways. But if you had gone with the other voices, which is with the hawks, you would have had more war and more disaster. So I think the fact that it seems like Trump is now going in this direction is a good thing. And in some ways, on the nuclear issue, appears to achieve more than was achieved in the JCPOA. Now, he could have achieved that short of war as well. And that's, of course, very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I just want to, for the audience, just break down, and we are live on Substack as well. And everyone, if you are on Substack or use Substack, do check out Trita's a Substack. It is breadth of knowledge and Trita Parsi, exactly. No, absolutely, you know, it's good. We're going to do more of these, I think, both on YouTube and Substack live, but I just want to get a couple of critical pieces of information here. So Trump has basically said that the deal is largely negotiated pending finalization. Now, this is an MOU. It's not technically legally binding. There's a lot of limitations with this, and that's largely because neither side has agreed to the two critical elements, which is the Strait of Hormuz and the enrichment. But from what I've been reading in the past hour that this announcement emerged, Trita, is that, you know, the United States seems to be agreeing to a huge spray of potential sanctions relief or other forms of financial benefits for the IRGC, right? The idea of maybe some kind of reparations. There's loads of variations here, and I've just seen on X as well that the foreign ministry spokesman has basically invoked the Roman Emperor Marcus Philippus, the idea of Persia, right? The Persian defeat of Rome, and just how much of a loss this is for the United States. What do you think?
Yeah, so undoubtedly both sides are going to try to declare victory in various ways. It's fascinating to me that the spokesperson of the Islamic Republic is using imagery from Iran's pre-Islamic past, in which its kings scored numerous military victories, but it is something that, at least in the first part of the Islamic Republic, they were trying to more or less erase. We've definitely seen a trend away from that, but this was quite noteworthy in my view. the idea of sanctions relief is going to be something in which a lot of the hawks in the United States will say that is a sign of failure. I think that's actually revelatory of the fact that they never intended sanctions to be a bargain, to be a point of leverage, but actually it's supposed to be permanent punishment. And they were never honest about that because the sanctions were always presented as leverage. But whenever it's come to a moment in which the leverage could be used, they've opposed it. And now they're again, pointing to large sanctions relief as being a point of failure for Trump. Whereas in reality, what's the point of having this leverage if you're never going to cash it in? If you're, I think we spoke about it before. If you're in Vegas and you're winning a lot of these different chips, but you refuse to cash it in, then you kind of misunderstood the entire point of the game here. So that for the United States to ultimately use the sanctions relief to get what it wants is not a point of failure in any way, shape, or form. It's actually going along with exactly what the sanctions were supposed to be on the face of it. Now, I do happen to believe that most of the elements that push for these sanctions did not intend for it to be used as leverage. They intended for it to be a permanent feature for permanently punishing various countries and keeping them down. And that's why they're upset. But that's not a defeat for the United States. That's a defeat for the war hawks.
Yeah, no, and we're already seeing this. I mean, I've seen at least half a dozen, I think, posts on X and other social media about just how much of a bad deal this is. I mean, I cannot, I think, emphasize enough that this is seemingly Trump just accepting some of the Iranians' most basic of demands, despite them claiming that this was never going to be the case. And what I love is that there are some people within the White House. I've already seen at least 3 administration officials, I think the deputy spokesman or something for the US administration, saying, those of you who will criticize this deal clearly aren't appreciative of Trump finding peace. Well, he's finding peace from a war that he chose to start. So it's not really it's not much of a starting point to make that claim. I don't know.
Yes and no. Again, I would agree with you if it is just a deal and they're back to their normal enmity, but they have a deal. Then not only was there no need for the war to start, there was actually a deal on the table before the war that he could have taken, he should have taken. But if you end up in a scenario, and by the way, that deal did not entail this degree of sanctions relief. But if you end up in a deal that actually ends up becoming an end to the 47 years of enmity and goes beyond just a nuclear deal, but is something bigger, then it is a movement that goes beyond what Obama also did. I think Obama wanted to go in that direction, but the Iranians were saying, let's first see what happens with the JCPOA before there is any further buildup. So is he a peacemaker in that sense? That's a difficult title to give him, given the wars that he has started. But once you have started this, if you're then moving towards actually ending it, and you're moving towards something that goes beyond just making a deal, but actually puts the enmity in the past, that is nevertheless a very significant development. I have to point out, most American presidents would not do this. They would not, they wouldn't have started the war either. That's a fair point. But in the negotiations, I've been fascinated to see how open Trump has been in putting sanctions relief on the table, way beyond what we ever saw under Obama or under Biden. And looking at that as a way of, cashing in those chips, using it as leverage, get what he wants, but also move into a new direction in which the US would trade with Iran, there would be investments in Iran, and there would be far greater connectivity between the two countries. If that is what ends up happening here, I don't think that is a small thing at all. I think that's actually a very noteworthy thing.
I appreciate that, but how can we confidently say that that's the direction of things, Trita? I mean, this is
again, we don't know.
Look, I'd like to fully agree with you, but it's my job to be to disagree at times, and I think this is one of those cases. I guess I don't. It's not that I disagree. I'm just cautious in how much we can confidently hope for that, because, as I say, this is the guy who claimed that a peace deal was on the way a month ago. He said it at the beginning of April. He said it. I went back and looked through. Unfortunately, I had to give myself time to look at Trump's writing, but I looked back at the amount of times he's mentioned, progress, peace deal imminent, these sorts of
rhetoric. But these are two different things. First of all, yes, we should hash out some disagreements, because that actually makes this a much more interesting conversation for everyone. So I'm totally with you on that. But if you're pointing to the fact that we cannot trust that he has said that there actually is a deal, I'm totally with you. He's said so many different things. It's next to impossible to trust anything that is coming out of his Truth Social. I think there's a couple of things here, though, that we should take note of that at least puts that issue to rest. First of all, the tweet itself made it very clear all of the different world leaders that he had discussed this issue with. And we see once again how the region is coming together and speaking in unison with Trump, save Israel, of course. And we had confirmation from from the Egyptians, and I think one or two other countries confirming what Trump said in his tweet. You pointed out what the foreign ministry spokesperson from the Iranian side said. I've spoken folks on the Iranian side. They agree. There is a memorandum of understanding. It has been reached essentially, or it is about to be reached. The details of it is still not entirely clear. So I think the fact that there's been some sort of a breakthrough, that's more or less clear. You're absolutely right on the second point, though. Can we be that confident that this breakthrough will go in the direction of actually changing the relationship between the two countries and ending the enmity? You're totally right. Perhaps there's too much optimism required to believe that. Perhaps there is not enough signs of it. Perhaps at the end of the day, Trump is someone who's not reliable even after the negotiations and a deal, and is going to walk certain things back, or that there will be sabotage efforts. That I think is absolutely valid. I would just point one counterpoint to it, which is if you have a deal that actually has more or less complete sanctions relief as part of it, then that in and of itself creates a trajectory that goes beyond anything we saw under the JCPOA. During the JCPOA, only secondary sanctions were lifted. And the secondary sanctions proved themselves to be rather limited in being able to move things in a dramatic way when it comes to the Iranian economy. The Iranian economy grew 67% on that. That's not a small thing. But there was constant hesitation as to whether countries could go back in. There was hesitation as to whether the deal will last. Once Trump came in, of course, it turned out it was very easy for him to rip the deal apart because there were no primary sanctions involved. There were no American companies that suffered from his ripping apart the deal. If you have primary sanctions lifted now, you have created a much stronger base for a deal that can last longer and that can have a trajectory that goes more in the direction of a real end to that enmity and a new future. No guarantee. It still requires optimism. I agree with you with that. But it is noteworthy that if this deal actually entails sanctions relief, it will be very different qualitatively from the previous deals.
I'll defer to your greater regional expertise on this, Trita, but I would just point out again to sort of take the other side a little bit. Trump has been one, and also I will caveat that this is obviously directly involving the United States in the military context, but Trump has negotiated 12, 15, 200 peace deals apparently in the past year and a half, right? I'm being slightly exaggeratory for effect, but simply what I mean is that a lot of them have actually only ever been MOUs. So he did this with Azerbaijan and Armenia to resolve that while they went back to skirmishes. And they did that with Cambodia and Thailand. These are the two most obvious examples. A month later, the Cambodians and Thais were fighting over, again, it's a very different level of conflict. So my point is simply that the MOU is good in principle, and I think we all want peace and some kind of sustainable structural resolution to this. I just worry about the efficacy of it longer term. And that's because of a couple of details, which I kind of want to get your take on. So in the statement, and as you rightly pointed out, what I think is interesting is that Trump took the time, or he told someone else to, probably by dictating it, to take the time to actually write out every single leader, capitalize it. Like, you don't do that unless that's a precursor to a proper kind of genuine commitment to a deal, right? You don't do that. It's not a casual thing for Trump to write all that out. But secondly, is he didn't mention Lebanon. And Lebanon is a critical component for Iran's expectations. So what is that sort of he's assumed that's the case because of what he said about Netanyahu? He had a good constructive conversation there, or could we see the other theatre in the Levant a potential deal breaker for this tentative agreement?
Absolutely. First of all, I think you're pointing to something that is really crucial, which is deals are not successful because they're reached. They're successful because they prove to be sustainable, and that both sides over a period of time are actually honoring them. And some deals are remarkably successful despite massive changes under the circumstances, such as, for instance, the Camp David Agreement. We've seen massive changes in the region, yet, and even regime change twice in Egypt, yet the Camp David Agreement sustained itself. So, I mean, that's, even though it got heavily criticized and Carter got bashed for it, etc., at the end of the day, it is something one can say has been remarkably successful. The JCPOA lasted 2 years and then the US walked out of it. Not a bad deal in my view. I still stand firmly behind it, but very sad to see that it wasn't successful in the sense of being able to be sustainable. And in that comes, of course, then the consistency of the implementation. And one thing I'm worried about is that it may be 30 or up to 60 days of further negotiations to reach a final deal. And that both sides can, through mutual agreement, further extend that time period. I understand a lot of these things are tricky. It's going to take some time. But a lot of time, 60 days, will provide massive opportunities for those who want to sabotage this, and this is primarily the Israelis, to find plenty of opportunities to do so. Change facts on the ground. As you mentioned, escalate in Lebanon, even though it appears that the MOU requires an end to the fighting in Lebanon. So it will give the Israelis too many opportunities, my view, to destroy the deal, sabotage it. And they have been very successful in doing that in the past, very successful. Not only vis-a-vis US and Iran, in other places. So there's huge amount of question marks, plenty of opportunities for saboteurs to sabotage it. And the longer that period is, the easier it will be for them.
So I just want to take a quick note to mention two things. Firstly, we are streaming to Substack, everyone, so do check out Trita Parsi Substack, which he is more and more active on in terms of writing. So am I. You can find live streams from other guests I've done, and yeah, good place to check it out. But second, I'm aware some of you are commenting about a potential White House shooting. I've been looking at that. Not enough information to go on, guys. So I'm going to focus on the Iranian deal because I think it's more important right now. And then we have more information to talk about it. I'm monitoring the US shooting situation, but it's quite speculative at the moment. So yeah, Trita, I mean, look, for me, I do think this comes down largely to Trump's ability to be persuaded by Netanyahu. But as we've seen in the past, right, it's ebbed and flowed. Bibi wanted to do stuff, late last year, and Trump basically told him to sod off. And then after the lack of progress in the peace talks with Iran in the earlier part of the year, he was persuaded to go for this. After the Israelis, presented him with enough supposed sustainable, sufficient intelligence that this would last a few days. So, how much do you think that the Israelis have the capacity to persuade Trump later on in the year if talks over Hormuz and enrichment don't go anywhere, especially as what we touched on last night about each's respective elections? How much do you think that plays a role?
I mean, look, if the talks, the 60-day, 30-day doesn't go anywhere, as you said, the Israelis may not need to do much for it to be sabotaged. So, this whole thing, the memorandum falls apart. Doesn't mean necessarily that we'll go back to a blockade of the blockade or that they will go back to warfare, because that's very costly, of course. But it will nevertheless be a more preferable situation from the Israeli standpoint if there never is that real agreement, because I suspect that there will not be any real sanctions relief until there is a final agreement. There may be some sanctions relief, opening of the unfreezing of assets and things of that nature. But the real sanctions relief, I doubt, will going to come very early. It will come once there is an actual agreement. So from the Israeli standpoint, that gives them all the incentives to try to prevent the agreement to actually be found. Will they be able to convince him? Keep in mind, the Israelis are going to be in their own election season and they will have to focus on other things. It will be very difficult to see the Israelis taking a very strong public position against the deal. In fact, what you're looking at right now is a lot of folks that are more or less acting inadvertently, deliberately, whatever, as proxies of Netanyahu in Washington, D.C. They are very vocal. I've not seen any reaction from the Israeli government so far, because it's very tough for the Israeli government to go up directly against Trump, particularly in this election season that they're now faced with. But they will do everything they can. They're not going to roll over and play dead in any way, shape, or form. They have a track record with the JCPOA that even when the deal was struck, even when it was reached, even when it was implemented, they never gave up. They did everything they could to destroy it, and eventually they were successful because they managed to convince Trump to do so. And I wouldn't be surprised that there will be a similar thing. But if Trump, and I've heard this from folk in the administration, if there is a deal, if Trump is happy with it, and if Trump chooses to look at it as his real point of legacy, not these nameless 7 to 8 peace deals that he made, no one remembers, that he can't even pronounce the names of the countries that he supposedly did peace with, but actually something that he really treats as his legacy, that will create another a ring of protection around it, in which it will be more difficult, more costly for elements to go after it because they're essentially targeting his legacy. Don't know if that's where things are going to go, but I've heard that from administration officials saying that if this actually ends up a deal that he really thinks is going to be his legacy, then he will do everything he can to protect it. But all of that, nevertheless, depends on whether they manage to go beyond this agreement. And this memorandum has been extremely difficult to negotiate, undoubtedly. But now they're going to go into a much more difficult phase, which is to actually translate that into an actual agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I remember correctly, it was the war between Azerbaijan and Albania, which is obviously very, anyway, yeah, no, look, I mean, the other thing, Trita, I'm quite curious about is, of course, what this means for Iran itself. Now, I was streaming with another colleague of the Atlantic Council, Alia Brahimi, just as the news came live, and we were sort of reacting to this. And one of the things that I remembered is that the Americans' original objectives were fourfold, right? They destroy their navy, destroy the capacity to launch, nuclear capacity, and the fourth one, basically incapacitate the regime to a significant extent after it became clear that regime change in its absolutist sense was a bit far-fetched for the Trump administration. But what the reality is that 70% of their launcher capabilities, 70% of their stockpiles still exist. And I think most crucially, especially in the context of Hormuz, 30 of the 33 critical sites across, is it southern Iran? I mean, please inform me if I'm wrong, still exist and are fully functional.
Yeah.
And that's
operational.
Operational. Yeah. So can you break down exactly what is the condition of the IRGC, and then we can go into the political element a bit more.
Well, first of all, when it comes to Iran's military capability, I think, we had these ridiculous statements coming out of Hexet claiming that everything has been won. I mean, the Navy had been destroyed 5 times over. And then you have the intelligence leaking a completely different picture. And that picture is corresponding with the reality on the ground as we see it, because if all of those Hexet statements were true, there shouldn't have been a negotiation of this kind. The US should have simply been able to dictate terms and the Iranians would be forced to accept it. But because they weren't true, and what the intelligence said was true, that's what, that kind of makes sense given what we're seeing here, which is an agreement that is not one that the US is dictating, perhaps not one that Iran is dictating either, but nevertheless, it's certainly not reflecting the reality that Hexet seems to want to say. This also reminds me of what happened with the Houthis. The US was actually taken quite aback to see how quickly the Houthis just dug up missiles, rebuilt the opening of the missile silos, and within 24 hours were shooting again. And they just kept on bombing and bombing and bombing, and it was just whack-a-mole, and ultimately the US ran out of gas and interest, and Trump just kind of ended this thing and never spoke about the Houthis again, I'm sure you've noticed. Except for at one point pointing out that the Houthis are a tough bunch of nuts. So, and it's the same thing I heard from folks at the Pentagon at the time who were saying, like, look, these are really, really surprisingly tenacious. And the same thing is now seen on the Iranian side. These are things deeply dug into the mountains, an apparent massive infrastructure underneath the mountains in which missiles are being moved from different openings and silos, etc. And despite massive bombing by the United States, ultimately, despite the fact that many of them were damaged, at the end of the day, 30 out of 33 are still operational, which means that if you were to go into a new military confrontation, you would face an Iran that has not really, has clearly recuperated from whatever bruises it got, may actually be even more advanced. It may have used this time, this ceasefire, to strengthen itself, just as it used the end of the June war to dramatically improve its military situation. And we see the results of that now. I was on a panel yesterday in Washington, D.C. with Joe Kent, who resigned, the most senior person from the administration to resign over the war explicitly. He did so very quickly. And I've known him for some time. And he said something on that panel, and I completely agree with it. And he said that, look, if there was a military option that Trump could have used to just turn this around, he would have done so a long time ago. This is not a scenario in which there were options on the table and he was just kind of like, should I go with this one? Should I go with that one? No, there are no such options. If there were, he would have used them. He would have gone after them one after one. It's just that there were no options because it was clear that the Iranians had escalation dominance. And whatever the US would do to damage it, the Iranians would be able to do even more to damage the global economy and Trump's political future. So at some point, he either would have to essentially go on a suicide mission and go into war again, or go for some sort of a deal. And I don't think the US side in any way, shape, or form negotiated in a soft way in this negotiation. I mean, there were still maximalist demands for a very long time in these negotiations. These were tough talks. If they were easy, it would have ended a long time ago.
They certainly would have done. But what does this tell us about the political capital that Trump has left? Because he, as I say, about a month ago was stating that a peace deal was imminent, that we were winding down. And I never assumed at all, I never even humored it for a moment, that we would return to the military intensity that we saw during March. Neither side, the Israelis and the Americans, let alone the Iranians, had that endurance. They could last if it was a slow burning type of situation as we've seen in the past 6 weeks with the Strait of Hormuz, but no way that level of aerial campaign. And we can see this because of the what's it done to the depletion of American stockpiles, Israelis. I've just seen on the news that the Americans have discontinued supply of Tomahawks to Japan. I'm not saying that they're immediately connected, but clearly the Americans are worried about their own military replenishment and stockpiles. And so I just wonder, like, how much could we see Trump being squeezed even more going down the line by the IAGC, do you think, if he's got the midterms to worry about? And it looks pretty, it's looking quite good for the Democrats in the Senate as well, actually. I was reading one article today.
Yeah. So I don't, if the Iranians and the IRGC just wanted to go for broke in terms of just destroying Trump altogether, they would not have struck a deal. And they would not have engaged in these type of negotiations. Now, are there elements there that may want to sabotage it? There's definitely saboteurs or potential saboteurs on the Iranian side as well. I think ultimately they recognize, okay, you could really do this, but then what? You have profoundly humiliated the United States. You may have completely ended Trump's political career and the political career of those in his circle. But you're still dealing with sanctions. You're still dealing with massive problems. You still don't have an agreement on the Strait of Hormuz. How's that actually putting you in a better position? So I'm not surprised that I've seen a very strong desire on the Iranian side to come to a deal. And of course, to come to a deal in which they will be seen, at least internally, as having won. And they will probably do whatever they can to make sure that externally there is that perception as well. And certainly they're not going to accept any rhetoric from Trump's side that would portray the situation as some sort of a devastating American victory. And I think it's very noteworthy. You were hinting at it earlier on. This was not a typical Truth Social post in which Trump is rage tweeting. All of the names were capitalized, their titles were correct, put in a specific order. The term Islamic Republic was used instead of just Iran. There were no insults. There was no gloating. It was a serious tweet. And I think that's, yeah, almost, it suggests that something serious actually is happening. Whereas when you take a look at some of those previous tweets, and you pointed to them as well correctly, that in which he was declaring all kinds of progress and we're around the corner, take a look at how they looked. And it's very, very different this time around. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, you also have statements coming from some of these regional powers, essentially validating what Trump was saying in that tweet. So I do think we should take this much more seriously.
No, absolutely. As I say, I saw this when it first came out, and in my experience of working in diplomacy, when there's a certain agency, a certain officiality, is that the right word? Professionalism to it. And this is so uncharacteristic of Trump. It's so much that he's trying to be seen as a head of state that is professional for whatever reason he cares suddenly. But let's flip this on its head briefly, because also I've seen the latest updates for anyone who is monitoring that. The law enforcement in the US is responding to the shooting in the White House. It happened about 15, 20 minutes ago. There were shots fired outside. US snipers are involved, but it seems to be relatively under control at the moment. But what does this mean for the Islamic Republic itself? Mojtaba hasn't been seen. Pezeskian and Agarachi have been, managing the situation incredibly smoothly, very professionally, to use that word again. So what does this demonstrate, I think, about the functionality of the Islamic Republic right now?
I think, again, we don't know enough of exactly how things are being done internally right now. This is a very different scenario. There's been a significant change at the very top levels of the government because of a large number of people being killed. Nevertheless, the system is clearly operating. It's operating very efficiently. It's been operating efficiently internally as well as in the negotiations. But there's also massive problems inside of Iran that have been set aside by almost everyone because of the war. Once the war is over, the issue of January 8th and 9th is going to have to be dealt with. And there is a huge, huge gap between large segments of the population and the government on this issue. Some call it a sea of blood between them, which in some luxurious way, the government has not had to deal with because there's been a war and because it's been seen as existential. Once the war is over, this issue is going to come back and they're going to have to deal with it. And it's going to be very interesting to see exactly what happens. Are they going to deal with this in the same kind of harsh, tone-deaf way that they have dealt with previous conflicts and protests and things of that nature? Or is it going to be something different this time around? I have no idea. What I can tell you, though, is that if there is no deal, there's no sanctions relief, the war does end, but the Iranians are dealing with even worse economic situation and an even worse trajectory. And on top of that, $300 billion of damages. Then I suspect that the most likely outcome is that the government will become even more repressive than it was before because it's the only card it has to play. But if it has sanctions relief, there is a different economic future, different economic trajectory. I think that gives them both confidence, but also it reduces a lot of the general pressure on the population. Now, whether they will use that in a constructive way to actually come to terms with what happened, deal with it in a fair, constructive way to reach true justice is a completely different issue. But at least in that scenario, I think there may be some pathways for them. But if there is no sanctions relief, then I think we will see exactly the same pattern that we've seen before, which is that the government just ends up becoming more and more repressive to keep control of a population that is suffering more and more because of economic mismanagement, corruption, and strangulation from the outside.
Okay, so that is exactly what I am fearful of and have been predicting for a while. I think you were one of the first people we ever discussed about it on these streams, which was the internalization and greater securitization of the state, which ultimately I think is more of an insult to the Iranian people, because this was all about liberating the Iranian people after the events of January 8th and 9th. But of course, they brought 47 years. So this just plays even more against the reputational damage for the US and Trump specifically. But before I go a little bit into that, I did want a bit of a take from you, if you think it's relevant. But we've seen, particularly from Iranian state media, like I think it's the Fars state media, discussing this idea of the Strait of Hormuz and that it will be returned to its previous conditions. Now, there's conflicting evidence here. The New York Times reported that it would be returned to basically the same previous condition versus what the Iranian state media is saying. So what do you reckon is more likely, or it's too early to tell because this will be one of the key points of contention in the days and weeks going out from this MOU?
I don't know who the New York Times have spoken to, and perhaps they have gotten some details from the US government that is not publicly available elsewhere. But I think it's important to point out that Trump only said that the strait would be open again. It being open and it being under Iranian control are not necessarily opposite things. It can be under Iranian control or Iranian Omani control and still be open to traffic, because at the end of the day, the Iranians never closed traffic. They charged the traffic. They closed the traffic to certain parties who they deemed to be aiding the countries that were attacking it. And that is inconsistent with international law. Once the war is over, however, it's going to be a different scenario. The Iranians are going to have a lot of challenges to be able to retain control and charge. Tolls are out of the question, but fees, etc., is still going to be a very tricky thing. But I think both sides have essentially said the same thing, but emphasized different details. Trump is just focusing on the fact that the strait will be open. He didn't say anything about who's controlling it or who's not controlling it. The Iranians are insisting that they're still in control, but they're not emphasizing or disputing that it will be open. So I don't think they've said different things. And from what I've heard from the US government since then is that strait is essentially for now resolved.
Okay, now that's a fair distinction. That's why we need to speak to experts like yourself, Trita, because it's that level of perception, right? What hasn't been said as much as what has been said. Okay, so let's just broaden this out a little bit. In the last couple of questions, I want to get your take on.
I got to run about 5-6 minutes, if that's okay.
There you go. Well, 2 questions, 2 minutes per question. Simply, what do you think how much do you think the Chinese were behind this, both for the Trump side, but also Iran? Because we know they've been pulling the strings a little bit. They've been working with the Pakistanis very intently. And I think Xi's visit or meeting with Trump definitely had an influence on Trump's mindset in the past week.
I agree with you on that, Piotr. I can't point to any specific example of any detail in which they had an influence. But I do think that the trip to China made it very clear to the US side that any hope that they had, because the original hope with the blockade of the blockade was that it would generate a conflict between the Iranian and the Chinese would start putting pressure on the Iranians. Right before Trump arrived, the Iranians struck a deal with the Chinese, and Chinese ships were no longer blockaded by the Iranians, which meant that if they ended up being blockaded, it would be by the United States. So the strait was open for the Chinese. If it wasn't, it would only be because the US. And I think it just made it very clear that relying on the idea, which I already at the time, you can go back and see what I said, relying on the idea that the Chinese would come in and pressure the Iranians would only happen if the US was putting a reasonable compromise on the table. Mm-hmm. But if the US was taking very strong maximalist positions, unreasonable positions, there's no way the Chinese, despite how much economic damage they would be suffering from, would come in on the American side, because they don't have faith in the American position. And coming in on the American side only meant that they would make themselves partly to blame for the failure that the US was pursuing. So And I think the US side had to essentially go to China to understand that that path really did not exist for them. And I think and I suspect that they also gave messages that they would be helpful with the Iranians if there was a genuine pursuit of a compromise. They were helpful in the past to get the first ceasefire. I don't know how much China's fingerprints will be on this, but I am under the impression that China is starting to emerge as the silent, indispensable political party in the region, in which any major conflicts going forward will require some sort of a buy-in or support from the Chinese, but without the Chinese taking credit, without the Chinese necessarily even wanting to have their fingerprints on it, but because so much ultimately depends on the economic power of China. This is the role the United States used to have. It had that military role and that economic role. It has lost the economic role to the Chinese, and now there's huge question marks about the validity, efficiency, and reliability of its military role as well.
Couldn't agree more. I think anyone who talks about the Chinese capacity to get involved more overtly fundamentally don't understand how the Chinese work in a foreign policy setting and what motivates them historically. But my last question, quick take from you, is simply what could be the possible obstacles to this working and lasting? Because to me, Netanyahu comes to mind, but also so does the IRGC, right? There are elements within the IRGC that are not going to be fans of this and may want to blow it up completely or significantly want to have it readjusted. So what do you think we should be on the lookout for?
So in a previous period, I think the way you phrased it would be quite correct, because IRGC would not be in control of the situation and they could come in at a late stage and sabotage it. I think we're in a very different scenario in which the IRGC they're owning the room at this point. They're in control of the country. None of these negotiations would have gone this far had it not been for the IRGC being on board. That doesn't mean that there may not be other spoilers, or there may not be other spoilers within the IRGC that last minute could come forward and push back. And you have other very conservative elements that are not necessarily all with the IRGC that already have taken strong positions and attacked the negotiators as they have done before. But I don't think it's any longer in the sense that the IRGC are not really at the center of things. And as a result, once there is a deal, they would come in and sabotage it. I don't think we would be even in this situation if the IRGC wasn't on board. But there are still massive risks of sabotage from several different areas. And certainly within the Iranian system, there's some. The attacks internally in the last couple of days against the negotiators has intensified. Arakchi, for instance, has been even gone as far as accusing him of giving away the location of the supreme leaders to the Israelis. So we're starting to see some very dirty attacks on the negotiators. So clearly there is also political pressure and opposition inside of that system. But I don't know if it is entirely correct, at least, to say that that is opposition that is coming from the IRGC necessarily.
Well, Trita, it's I'm really very grateful for you to jump on very last minute. And as I said at the beginning, everyone, we've been also streaming to Substack. So do go and subscribe, follow Trita Parsi on his Substack. He's doing more writing over there. And we're going to be doing more live streams, I think, on there as well. So do follow us both on there. I'm going to stay on a little bit longer, Trita, just to sort of give
All right. Thank you so much, Piotr. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course, mate. Thanks. Have a good one.